Hello, everybody. My name is Jose Martin Samano, TV Azteca News anchor, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion where we will talk about can we avoid creating new disaster risk in the years to come. In the next 15 years, around $6 trillion will be invested globally in urban infrastructure such as roads, bridges, public utilities, hospitals, schools, houses, office, and manufacturing facilities. Therefore, it is our opportunity to build a more resilient world that will considerably reduce future economic losses. You know, economic losses due to disasters reach $520 billion globally each year. Billions of dollars that could be better invested in health education sectors. Well, we are all responsible for resilience, but the private and the public sectors are even more responsible as they will be the ones investing millions in new infrastructure in the future. 80% of infrastructure investments will be made by the private sector. Now, how can we make sure that this infrastructure will be safe and resilient against disasters? And what can be done to ensure that this new stock of assets will not create new risks and generate more economic losses in the future? I am very pleased to introduce you to my 5 panelists today. Well, first of all, we have on my left, Mr. Aris Papadopoulos. He's a retired CEO of Titan America and Rice board member. Thank you very much for being here, Aris.
Thank you, Martin.
And we also have Mr. Saber Chowdhury. He's member of the Parliament of Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
We also have Marta Herrera Gonzalez from Mexican cement company Cemex. Marta, good to have you here.
Thank you, Jose Martin.
Mr. Simon Klaw, he's AXA head office in Paris, France.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And we also have Mr. Carlo Papa from Enel, Italy.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Well, to all our viewers around the world, please be aware that you can participate with your questions, your opinions through the hashtag #GPTDebate. It appears on screen. It will be on throughout all our transmissions, so you can write down your questions, and we will be presenting them at the end of this debate. Now, what we are talking about? Well, you know what? Member states, they have a big plan. They have a big plan for 2030 agenda that will help eradicate poverty and build a sustainable development for all. Building safe infrastructure is a key element of success to achieve the 2030 agenda, together with the Priority 3 and Target E of the Sendai framework, which aims to build safer infrastructure. Let us remind that the Sendai framework is a 15-year plan adopted in Japan in March 2015 to reduce human and economic disaster risks. How resilience is so crucial for building a sustainable development? Well, let me tell you that by year 2050, 9 billion people will be living in this planet, and 75% will be living in the cities. Asia and Africa will be the 2 continents with a great demand for more schools, bridges, hospitals, roads, and houses. And there is simply no way to reduce poverty if we do not manage better disaster risk. First question is for Mr. Aris Papadopoulos. Well, you founded the nonprofit Resilient Action Fund, and you are promoting greater disaster resilience in the built environment. Can you tell us what is the role of entrepreneurs in the challenges ahead?
Thank you, Jose Martin, and welcome audiences both here in Cancun and around the world. This agreement, the Sendai Framework, is one of the most important agreements in the history of the UN. And yet most people don't know about it compared to the Rio Climate Agreement of '92 or the Paris Agreement. And yet I like to tell people that this agreement is as important as those agreements and sets the foundation for resilience. And I hope that this broadcasting can help address that, because I've called it the UN's best-kept secret. And we are at the beginning of a movement on resilience, similar to the 70s and 80s, where we had the movement on conservation, the 90s and 2000s, the movement on green. The movement on resilience is about to begin, and this creates opportunities and markets for businesses and entrepreneurs. That's why a lot of us here are members of the UN Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies, called ARISE, and I encourage businesses around the world who have a similar interest in resilience to look at this UN ISDR-led organization and participate along with us. But let me be more specific on the types of opportunities for business entrepreneurs. And these include not just for mitigation and response, in which there are a lot of products and services, because every movement creates new markets for products and services, but particularly in prevention and mitigation, in other words, the essence of resilience. And it's not just building materials and better building methods, but also other financial products, such as resilience financing, resilience insurance, other resilience services, and particularly information products and services. Because what consumers need today, whether they're business consumers or private consumers, is better information on hazards. And I'll just mention one example here. Billions of people around the world have access to this. What if through this smartphone device, they could see whether their home or a home they're looking to rent or to buy is in a hazard-prone area or is built resiliently? Would that affect their choice, their decisions? And if it affected their decisions, would it affect then the decisions of builders and of investors in those buildings? And that's just a small example. So, I think there's great opportunities, and I look forward to this dialogue that we're going to have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aris Papadopoulos. Very interesting what you're saying. And the next question is for Marta Herrera Gonzalez from CEMEX. Marta, what can the private sector do to build a safer world?
Well, thank you, Jose Martin, and hi, everyone here and out there. I think the private sector has a strategic and essential role, and also a shared responsibility in generating higher resilient levels in individuals and their livelihoods. I can think in a lot of examples, but I can give you 6 examples in which we can generate value on resilience. One is the creation of partnerships, partnerships with multi-sector and multi-stakeholder alliances with other companies, with the government, with NGOs, with the academy, with the specific communities, thinking in a systemic way to collaborate, putting people and their livelihoods on the center, and thinking about all the elements that coexist in those ecosystems. A second way in which we can create value is in sharing knowledge. We need to share best practices and collaborate with them. We need to raise awareness with people in the surrounding communities, but in society in general. We need to innovate and to discover new ways of doing things, new business models, and we need to design resilience processes and specific projects. We need to develop policy innovation, and those are the things that we can share knowledge. The third thing that I can think is to promote technology development in different sectors, like in energy and water and waste and housing and infrastructure. Another element, the fourth one, as an example, is we need to be more efficient in open data management. We need to be able to standardize data, to be able to combine it, to compare it, and to produce information that can be useful for decision making, and to have the indicators in which we can monitor progress. That's very important for the private sector. The fifth is innovation in the financial mechanisms. There is a lot of economic tools and a lot of financial plans, but the economic losses are very profound. And we need to come up with different financial instruments to generate more resilient communities.
We have 15 seconds, Marta, please.
And the last one is to drive resilient projects. Very specific ones like water management, sanitation, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta Herrera. Now, Mr. Carlo Papa from Italy. You're from Italy, which, of course, has been affected by many earthquakes in history. How can the private sector help Italy and other countries safer against disasters, Carlo?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here again, Jose Martin. We are actually based in Italy, but we have operation from the Urals to the Andes. So fortunately and unfortunately, we experience the effect of this new situation, and my thoughts are going to our colleagues in Peru and the Peru community that were hit in March by the disaster that you know, and clearly to the earthquake in Italy. So Let's say we have one simple formula that is simple to mention, very difficult to put in practice, but we put our effort. And every power sector entity should do the same, that is build in safety from the very beginning. So we operate, we construct and operate a production and distribution of electricity in 31 countries all over the world. What is paramount for us is building in resiliency when we plan the construction of something, when we actually construct, and after we manage. Now, it's really of foremost important also the cooperation with the public sector. And we should, and we try to be clean in the cooperation with the public sector, not only when the disaster happens, but when we plan and foresee a disaster and we need to avoid risks. So again, building resiliency is the key element for us as an infrastructure provider. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlo Papa. And next, Mr. Saeed Chowdhury, parliamentarian from Bangladesh. Well, you come from a country which is prone to all kinds of disasters, just like Mexico. And you're a parliamentarian. How do you see the role of government and, in particular, parliaments in advancing resilience, Mr. Chowdhury?
Thank you for that question. I think if I look at it from the point of view of a parliamentarian, what is our basic function? One is to represent the people who have elected us. So when you talk about representation, you're looking at their safety, their security, their well-being, the environment that they live in. And at the constituency level, I think the first thing is, who are the people who are at danger? Who are the people who are at risk? Try to identify them and find solutions. The second is, governments have signed up to the Sendai framework, as my colleague just mentioned. So holding governments to account for international commitments that they enter into. So the government must deliver. And that is also the function of a parliamentarian, what we refer to as oversight. So is the government doing what it has agreed to do or what it has signed up to do? I think the third aspect is legislation, because laws are important, regulations are important, building codes are important, how we can facilitate greater interaction and engagement with the private sector. Those are all in the area of laws, regulations, and I think that's something which is important. And of course, you need money. When you're talking about how do you try and reduce risk, you're talking about a premium. You have to invest more. So instead of spending $10, maybe you have to spend $12 or $13. And Parliament is the institution that, in fact, appropriates resources through the budgetary process. So make sure that the projects, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is hospital, whether it is school, whether it is water, which is another emerging threat and challenge, because we know that in probably another 15 years' time, there is going to be a shortage of fresh water. So what do we do in that area? So I think resourcing is also a very important part. And finally, policy coherence. All of the things that a government is doing, does it actually fit? Does it actually come together? Does it make sense?
Would you say that resilience is a word that should be more present in legislations around the world?
I think it should be, because what we are really talking about is things that we do every day. What do we do when a child is born? We vaccinate the child. Why? Because we are trying to enhance their immune system. We don't cross the road anywhere. We cross the road where there is a pedestrian sign for us to cross. We don't buy food from the supermarket, which has already expired. So these are things that we do. But I think we need to apply it at the broader sense and at the national level.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury. And Mr. Simon Klaw from AXA Insurance, as you well know, is a very important part of the solution. How do you think insurance can help create a safer world, since today only 2% of middle-income countries are exposed to disasters and have some kind of insurance instrument in place?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I do think insurance is part of the solution, and I think for two principal reasons. One is obviously insurance provides immediate funds when a disaster takes place. So it actually facilitates the recovery from disaster. It makes sure that recovery is much quicker. It supports the economy, it supports local businesses. It helps people get back on their feet much more quickly. So I think in that respect, insurance helps. But actually there's a deeper reason, which is insurance drives better standards. If you're going to insure something, if you're going to insure a building or a piece of infrastructure, you need to know that it respects certain standards. And if those standards are sufficient, and if those standards are enforceable, and they're enforced, and that's a very important point, I think, because in many countries there are standards, but they're not properly enforced. By making the building or the piece of infrastructure insurable, you're also making it more resilient. So I think the process of insurance can actually help build resilience into economies. And you mentioned the lack of insurance, particularly in emerging markets. And I think actually in Mexico the figure is below 2% of the country's GDP. I think to a certain degree that will change as you get economic growth and countries become more prosperous. I think that will change to a degree. But actually I think the insurance industry has to be a little bit more innovative. I don't think in the future that you're going to be able to sell insurance in Mexico or in India or China in the way that in the past you sold it in the US or in Europe. So I think the insurance industry is going to have to look at different ways and different mechanisms, and that may be insuring countries through sovereign programs. It may also be programs where the premium is paid not by the individual, not by the beneficiary, but actually by another organization or by the country as a whole. So I think a lot of work is going on in that area, and a lot of these programs are being developed. The scale isn't there yet, so a lot more work needs to be done.
Why would you say that in countries like Mexico there is such a short use of financial instruments like insurance?
Well, I think in part it's affordability. In part, it's often a lack of awareness of insurance in the way that we understand it as a financial product. And I think both of those things will change over time. But it's also a lack of awareness in many ways that there is this risk, and it is a growing risk because obviously we're seeing the economic losses from natural catastrophes expand enormously. And that's one of the reasons the insurance industry is so interested in resilience rather than insurance, in risk prevention and mitigation rather than insurance per se. So I think it will improve, and it will help when governments are very aware, as they are in places like Mexico and the Philippines. So I think we will see an expansion in insurance as a mechanism.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Klaw. Well, let's take a quick break, and we will return immediately to this debate. Let me remind you, please, that we have a hashtag. It's GPT Debate, where you can send your questions, your opinions about this discussion that we're having today. And at the end of this show, we will talk about it, and we will air some of your questions. We'll be back. Thank you very much for staying tuned. You know, yesterday here in Cancun, ministers met at the Leaders Forum and discussed about what can be done to reduce disaster risks and to stop creating new risks in the future. In this section, each of the panelists will discuss on this particular matter. Mr. Carlo Papa from Enel, what do you do as CEOs to reduce disaster risk in your company and at the country level as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think, there are three words that we can keep in mind to think about the way we need to prepare. One is awareness. So we need to be aware that the new operating condition in which we are moving our business, we develop our life, our kids go to school, is a different one. So things out there are changing and are changing pretty quickly. The second is definitely preparation. We need to be prepared. As I was saying before, we need to be prepared, in our case, when we build infrastructure. If there are electricity, gas, or water, whatever infrastructure we'll build, we need to build in resiliency from the very beginning. And as Marta correctly was pointing out, in doing this exercise, we need to be open. We need to be open to other people doing the same job and trying to converge to invest more money in the same battle. We need to converge with technologies provider adopting the newer technologies, and we need to make sure those technologies are implemented throughout our network. And finally, let me say that we do need passion because, especially in our business, in the aftermath of an earthquake, if someone calls you in the middle of the night and you need to get electricity or water or communication delivered to the firefighters into the field, you may have your home that is broken and affected by the earthquake, but you still need to go out. And I'm talking about experience that as my colleagues have lived in the field. So a bit of passion for what we do, even if we come from the business, it needs to be there. In our case, serving 65 million people, it's even more, we feel this need to serve the people that we work for. And so, I mean, again, I would say awareness, preparation, and passion in doing our work, and trying to move this same subject into the table of public decision makers. I definitely say, as Aris was saying, that decision maker, by signing this NDAG agreement, have moved a step forward, because they put forward the idea that we have a new operating condition. And the same in terms of preparation, the public sector, as Mr. Pineda, for example, showed us about the civil service in Mexico. They're doing a lot of things. Maybe we should all have more passion in doing this activity and make sure that our activities are synergistic, taking an holistic approach to resiliency.
This passion, of course, has to be shared by the government, by the authorities.
But I must say, from my experience, the government are not short of passion. I mean, the people that are facing daily this problem, that are called in the middle of the night, have this passion. We should, make sure that this passion get through the organization, and at the end of the day, it's transformed in proper rules and regulation that can be incentivize investment in resiliency, or in certain cases are, as my fellow board members Aris say very often, enforce and oblige people that are doing building or construction to accept a certain set of rules.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Mr. Aris Papadopoulos, how can we make sure that the new stock of assets that will be built in the future in Asia and mostly in Africa will be resilient?
Thank you, Jose Martin. That's a very important question. And yesterday I heard at the Leaders Forum, I think it was from the representative of the World Bank, that we're going to be investing more in the next several decades than we have in the past 6,000 years of human life. And I'll talk about 2 points here. And a lot of that investment will be in the developing world.
Yes.
And I want to make a point first on infrastructure. Yes, infrastructure is important, and a lot of that investment that they're making will be infrastructure. And we want resilient infrastructure. But that infrastructure has to be in the right locations. And let me explain what that means. Building resilient infrastructure in the wrong locations only increases risk. I'll give you an example. You build a resilient bridge to a barrier island that's flood prone, and then you have development, residential, commercial on that island. What have you created? A future disaster. Okay. So land use planning, appropriate government thinking down the road, and making land, the resilient land, available, because a lot of times the most resilient land is not available for development. And people have no choice but to build in the wrong places. So it's a bigger issue than just blindly investing in infrastructure. The second point I want to make is that housing, our homes and small businesses, are actually the most vulnerable part of our communities. It's not the public facilities, not the infrastructure. The weak underbelly, the disaster losses are being strongly felt in homes and houses. And there's many reasons for that. Basically, those are built to the lowest level. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the issue always comes up, well, we can't raise the standards because we're going to make it unaffordable. And yet I'd like us to reposition the question and say, instead of trying to make risk affordable, instead of lowering our standards, let's set the right standard and try to make resilience affordable. And there's many things we can do that if we can work together between the public sector, the private sector, and society. For example, train people better on resilient construction methods, make resilient materials and methods more economic. There's always a learning curve. Things always start more expensive, but as you get volume, as you go down that learning curve, you can bring down those costs. Encourage other services such as banking, insurance, tax incentives to make it affordable for resilient, especially housing. So I appreciate that answer, and I hope I've given you enough information and the panel to work from.
Absolutely, Aris. Thank you very much. Next question is for Marta Herrera from CEMEX. What is CEMEX and the Mexican building sector doing to achieve a more resilience at a national level, Marta?
Well, we are a 110-year-old global company, proudly Mexican, and we have a very clear purpose. We want to build a better future. For that, what we are doing is developing inclusive and sustainable and resilient solutions for the construction company to improve quality of life of the people and their livelihoods, and at the same time put a higher criteria on resilience. We do this because of strategic purposes. We do it because we want to grow, we want to be sustainable, we want to be inclusive, we want to enter new markets, we want to manage our risks better. And we do it in an integral way. From the inside first, we need to have, and we do a very comprehensive process for managing our risks and resilient risks, and to attend contingencies in our country and outside our country. We had a specific purpose on a very important one in security and health of our employees. That's our main concern, and their families and their communities. That's on the inside. We are doing a lot of research for producing new and better products and offer new and better solutions on the construction industry. From the outside, we're working together with a lot of partnerships. We have more than 30 partnerships for resilient processes, local, national, and international. Here, for example, we work very close together with the Chamber of Construction Industry, with National Agency for Protection, Civil Protection. We work close together with Aris. We're part of it. We work with UN Habitat, with Habitat for Humanity. We work with the 100 Resilient Cities Project platform. We're developing specific projects with specific objectives and targets. We are trying to revolutionize in new products with concrete to produce better infrastructure. And specifically, we're working on housing. We have a very important model since 20 years ago to produce resilient and sustainable housing throughout the world, specifically in Mexico and Latin America. We have worked together with more than 4 million people to produce their own patrimony.
Better products bring more resilience.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Marta. Mr. Simon Klaw from AXA. Well, you know, Africa and Asia will make millions of investments in the near future. How can financial institutions guarantee resilience?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's not just Africa and Asia, of course. There'll be a lot of investment across the planet, and a lot of it, as Aris was saying, will be in infrastructure and new housing and so on. The short answer is that the financial sector cannot guarantee the resilience, and certainly can't do it alone. I think there are two sides to this. On the one hand, the financial sector has an awful lot of resources. You know, my company has 1.4 trillion euros in assets under management. So that gives you a lot of leverage. So the question really is, for the financial sector, how do you use that for good? How do you use that to build resilience? The other part is that as an insurance company, we're very natural long-term investors, because our insurance products will last 20, 30, 40 years. And of course, in order to hedge those liabilities, we want long-term investments that will give us income over that period of time. So infrastructure is an ideal investment for us. Now, what we're finding is that, of course, regulation has to be reckoned with, and at times regulation is very conservative, and it doesn't make life necessarily very easy. And you also have to consider that a lot of the money that we manage is not our money, it's our customers' money, and we have to invest it so that it generates returns. So it does limit our room for maneuver to some degree, and I think, you know, that's where a lot of people see the financial sector, and they see a very conservative part of the economy, and I think that goes some way to explaining why it's quite so conservative. Another aspect is actually that although we're very natural investors in infrastructure and long term, and although we're looking to invest more in green infrastructure, and although we are tripling our green investments at AXA over the next few years, there isn't the projects in the pipeline for us to invest in. We need more viable, genuinely green, genuinely resilient infrastructure in which to invest. And I think there's a great opportunity there for us in the industry to talk to government, to talk to other actors, to try and get more viable projects in which to invest. And then I think you will find more of the insurance industry will start investing in the infrastructure, and that is obviously investment that we need.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sabi Chowdhury from Bangladesh, how can parliamentarians and public sector avoid the creation of new risks? Let's please answer.
I think as we have just heard from Simon also, what you are now looking at is a completely new level of partnership. It is not very usual for the public and the private sector to work together. I think parliamentarians really have to see what sort of enabling environment we can create. So whether that is legislation to facilitate public-private partnership, whether the regulations. I don't think we want adventurous regulations, but we certainly have to move away from conservative regulations so that they facilitate this interaction. So I think that is very important. So re-looking at the partnerships, re-looking at the dynamics of how various stakeholders come together, I think that's going to be important because the world that we live in today is a very different world from what it was, let's say, 20 years ago. The hazards are multiple in nature. The risk element has gone up tremendously, because of climate change and everything else that is happening. And of course, man-made risk, that is also going up because of faulty development plans. So I think the environment has changed completely. And in that changed environment, you need to have new partnerships. Sharing information with the private sector, sharing data with the private sector, learning also from the private sector. We are looking at how can we understand risk? What is risk? How do we understand risk? How do we calculate risk? And the insurance companies, the private sector has a lot of information. So I think it's a two-way process. And if that can flow from both sides, then probably we reach a place where we can work together. But all of this is on the implicit assumption and the reality that we have to forge new partnerships. And I think the partnership with the private sector is going to be a very critical and defining partnership in our response to creating a society which is able to control the risk.
Well, thank you very much. Anybody in the panel would like to add something to this particular point?
I agree fully with my colleague here at the panel. There's a lot that can be done between the public and private sector to create the right incentives. Because our world works around economics. And if we can create the right economic incentives to motivate the right behavior, which is investing in resilient buildings, in resilient homes.
Will you give us a practical example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, one example, for example, today you can get the same bank loan rate, you pay the same real estate taxes per square foot or whatever per value, whether you have a resilient building or home or non-resilient one. So if we want to really incentivize resilience, why not reward those who are being resilient and actually charge more to those who are not being, because those who are not being are burdening the social costs of the cities or the communities that they're in. So, we should recognize resilience as a factor in the policies that we make. And those can, parliamentarians and various government levels can help us considerably in that direction. If we can jointly discuss the economics, the underlying economics that drive this behavior.
Do you agree in this, Marta?
Yes, I think that we need to have a more creative way in collaborating between public and private. I guess there should be some incentives, but at the same time, we should collaborate in different forms in promoting innovation and specifically finding the hotspots and working together, trying to promote not to have infrastructure in those hotspots and things like that. I guess the work should be done very collaborative with academy too, and also with the NGOs and the community themselves.
Can I just come in here and just add to,
Yes.
you wanted a specific example. If we look at how the renewable energy sector has grown, it was essentially looking at tariffs, the feed-in tariffs. So how can we encourage renewable energy? And you've seen governments taking action. They were giving more attractive tariff for the solar energy. So that is one very clear way where through government intervention, you're able to attract investment in a sector which otherwise there wouldn't be any investment. Now, of course, the threshold, the entry level has come down because the research has advanced, the volumes have increased. So, solar energy you can put up a plan for far less than what was the case before. Let's say you're going to construct a building. If the building is as per code, if it is a green building, there can be tax breaks, there can be incentives in the amount of holding tax, in the amount of municipal corporation tax. So I think there are various ways in creating that incentive to ensure that the investment comes to the sectors and it comes from the areas and from the players that you want.
In Jordan, for instance, where I was just recently, each and every single building and house has to have solar panels. That is a must. So it creates
And
a
I think so. I think it's really science driving policy, and that policy taking into account the commercial realities and trying to create the incentives and the enabling environment. I think that's really what you're trying to create.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're going to take a new break, but we will return shortly. Remember, you can follow us and also write your questions, your opinions at #GPTB debate. We'll be back.